Welcome to Philosophy 4 at Las Positas College. This lecture is about Immanuel Kant. Kant is the last of the four philosophers that we will be looking at in this section. Like the other philosophers, Kant does a lot of work to respond to skeptical problems like those of Sextus, David Hume, and Descartes. So Kant was born in 1724. He lived until 1804. He was born in Germany. You can find the reading in your Moser textbook on page 199. Kant is often referred to as an empirical realist, meaning that Kant believes that the world really is the way it seems and is described correctly by science. But Kant is also considered a transcendental idealist. This means that Kant believes that things only are the way they are because our human minds make them that way. A major distinction by which Kant divides everything in the conceivable world is into phenomena and noumena. Phenomena are just things as they appear to us. All objects we know are phenomenal in that they are how reality appears to us. On the other hand, noumena or noumena are things as they are in themselves. All we can know is that noumena exist because there must be something that is grounding the appearances that we experience. So here's a quick overview of the world of our experience on Kant's view. The way we get the representations of the world that we get, Kant says, starts with pure intuition. Pure intuition then is processed with the faculties of space and time. Pure intuition is further processed through what Kant calls the categories, and as a result of this, perceptible objects that we experience in the world are constituted or brought together or made perceivable for us. So let's talk a little bit about the individual elements in this four-part process. So first we talked about pure intuition. Everything starts with pure intuition for Kant. And pure intuition is our first awareness of objects. You might think of it as sort of our sensory stream. And for Kant, it cannot be directly described. The reason our pure intuition cannot be directly described is because every kind of description we could offer would require concepts, but a pure intuition is what's hypothesized to be just the bare perceptual stream itself, without any conceptual or categorical work making sense of that perceptual stream. Pure intuition, by the time it's an experience for us, is always involving these concept-laden elements. And these concept-laden elements include space and time. Now for Kant, space and time are our ways of filtering the pure sensory data from experience. Now what's unusual about his view is that for Kant, space and time are not things that exist out there in the world already, but space and time are faculties through which we filter or we construct the raw data of experience to make sense of it. If there were no time, the raw data of experience would just be chaos. If we couldn't divide the experience that we have of the world into spatial components to make sense of that data, again, the world would not be something that we could experience. So space and time are human faculties we use to process the raw data of experience. Now, in addition to this, there's more that goes into making up experience, right, than just things exist in a particular place and they occur over a certain time. And these other elements that make sense of our experience, Kant refers to as the categories. Our minds apply concepts such as substance and cause and effect, similarity and difference. These concepts are applied to make sense of experience for us. Without cause and effect, there'd be no way to understand that the wind made a tree branch hit my head, and when my head was hit, it made my head hurt. There's a whole series of causes and effect that makes sense of that experience. We think of things as objects with substances to allow for creating the kinds of events that we experience to make sense of the world. Even my perception of myself requires similar types of categories. I experience myself as similar to yesterday, but I experience myself as changing over time. So ultimately what we have, when we take the raw data of perception and turn it into something that can be experienced, is the phenomenal world, the world that we know and experience as the world of perceivable things. So we have the world in itself. Pure intuition gets processed through space and time, and then further processed through the categories, things like unity, variety, cause and effect. These are the categories of the understanding, where this data is supplied by the categories of the understanding. As a result, we have the world as it exists for us in the world of perception, or the phenomenal world. That green ball and Descartes' chair sitting by the fire emerge as a result of this kind of processing. In the end, we have the noumenal world as well as the phenomenal world. Now this diagram is another way to try to think of Kant's theory of the mind and experience. All of these models have limitations as models, but it might help us to picture what's going on. So the noumenal world, or the world in itself, is a world that we can never know directly, because we can't experience things outside of space and time and without the categories of the understanding. So what is it like? Well, it's just sort of a big question mark. But Kant does believe there must be some thing in itself, some noumenal world, something outside of experience, which is grounding my experience. Notice I can't quite say causing my experience, because cause and effect are categories that we apply over here. But that pure intuition does somehow reach me, and when it does, space and time go on to process that intuition. It's further processed with the categories of the understanding: cause, effect, similarity, difference, substance. And then ultimately what we end up is what we have as our own perceptual experience, or the phenomenal world. Other people have the same experience, but it's generated with their own mental processes to create the experiential world that we share. Another way to think about this same process, though, as a model, would be to reverse the model. We could think about ourselves existing here and projecting out the capacity to view space, the capacity to conceptualize objects by similarity and difference and substance and causation. And by projecting these things outward, space and time and the categories of the understanding, we project out into this shared collective space a view of the external phenomenal world. Of course, this phenomenal world doesn't belong just to me. It belongs equally to other observers who are using the same categories of the mind to view the world with the same mechanisms and in the same way. So the phenomenal world is shared by us. It is described by science, in the case of Kant, even by the laws of nature, but only in the phenomenal sense. This is the empirical realism combined with the transcendental idealism. So the resulting view of the world does, in a way, reverse our normal way of thinking about things, because as you look out in front of you now, the computer screen in front of you and the spatial world around you, we tend to think of that as objective. For Kant, those spatial properties, the division of things into spatial location and into objects, is something that is done by our mind as an active process to experience. Now, I mentioned that there's something wrong with all of these models. Maybe you've already sort of seen what that is. It's that Notice we've represented the perceiver here, let's say this is me, as a physical object already. But of course, physical objects for Kant don't exist as physical objects until we get here to the representational level of the phenomenal world, which means really all that exists on this side is mind and not myself as a physical being. A similar confusion could come from this model as well, because right now I have it as if the pure intuition is entering sort of through my eyeball. But of course, on Kant's view, this physical me, including my physical eyeball, is the way I look at myself as an object. And so even the construction of things like the way we think of ourselves physically is a result of seeing the world through these categories with these functions of space and time. So don't get confused by these models into thinking it's directly similar to, let's say, a physical account of the world where we're talking about eyeballs and retinas and spatial centers in the visual cortex of our brain. In a way, it's similar to that. Now, of course, a key question for us is going to be, how does Kant think he can solve the epistemological problems of skepticism that we've talked about before, using this point of view that we've talked about? Well, his overall proof strategy here, at least an important part of it, is through using transcendental arguments. A transcendental argument works in this way, that if a principle is necessary to even make experience possible, then we know that principle is valid. If something is necessary for experience, then I can know that any experience will follow that same pattern, and that principle will underlie any possible experience that a human could have. And for Kant, actually, it doesn't apply only to humans, it actually applies to anyone who could experience. So if there are thinking beings on other planets, Kant would claim that they have to organize the world according to space and time and cause and effect, just like we do, in order to make sense of that experiential world. So going back to some of the questions we've been looking at over time here, if we ask Kant, how do we know that the external world exists? Kant would say, well, that's a complex question. If you mean the phenomenal external world, which is what he thinks we mean when we say the external world, that phenomenal external world is the only possible way to perceive objects. Now, if what we're talking about is the noumenal world, the noumenal external world in itself, well, all we can really know about that, this might remind us of Locke, is that there must be something that's grounding my experience of the world, and that is the world in itself, or the noumenal world. Now, what about things like the laws of science and math? How do we know that these are universal things? Because Kant thinks we do actually know that the laws of geometry, for example, will always apply, or basic principles of causation, actually some of Newton's principles. Kant is going to say Hume's right that we can't know universal laws by observing the cases, because individual cases never give you a law. But here's what he thinks we can do. We can know that laws will apply universally without exception because those laws are just a function of the categories of the mind, along with our faculties of space and time. So we know they will apply to any possible object because they are the tools that we apply to every possible experience to make sense of it. So we know that if we are having a consistent experience of the world, it will always follow those principles because they are what make experience possible. With cause and effect, like we've said, that's the way the human mind organizes experience of the world. Things like math, well, math is a function of those numerical categories relating to the faculties of space and time. Geometry, Kant wants to say, is just taking that grid work of space that we normally project out and then thinking about how spatial relationships work in the pure abstract. So we're sort of accessing that potentiality for spatial representation, but accessing it in the absence of any actual object experience. Now you remember that problem of Thomas Hobbes. Well, if these laws of science really do apply to everything in the world, then it looks like my physical body is just a machine following those physical laws, and I must not really be free. But Kant has given himself a way to try to respond to this. Kant will say that those laws that we experience within our world as explaining everything that occurs within the world, including my physical body, well, those laws are only talking about the world of experience, because those laws are imposed on all experience. But those laws, remember, do not belong to things in themselves. Which means, yes, when I look at my physical body, there are going to be laws explaining why I raised my hand. He's going to agree with Hobbes on this account. But those laws only explain how we must see the world when we look from the scientific perspective, and it only explains the phenomenal world. Kant still believes we can rationally say that we could be free as a thing in itself outside of that realm of the laws of nature. If we look back at this diagram, we see here the phenomenal world. But this is generated by me. What am I? In myself. I'm the being who synthesizes the world in this way, but in myself, am I subject to those laws? Again, this isn't my physical self, this is my mind. Kant wants to say, I don't have to think of myself as subject to these laws because I'm imposing those laws on the external world. So what about the nature of the self? You remember that Hume had said, we never experience anything that's the same in ourselves consistently over time, so we don't have some essential self. In a way, Kant is partly agreeing with this, but he says what we mean by the self is just that space wherein all of our possible ideas and experiences occur. That is what he calls a transcendental notion of a self. I can also have a psychological notion of myself just by observing my thoughts and experiences over time. Now, it's important that for Kant there are serious limits to our potential for knowledge. Because as we saw in our diagram, all my mind can ever tell me is about how objects must be perceived in the world. Now, what about these other things that we saw the philosophers of this period are very concerned about? What about God, the afterlife, and human freedom? Kant is pretty clear that these things do extend beyond our possible experience, and so we can't really know them. God is an infinite being, the afterlife would go on forever, it's beyond our ability to perceive. Human freedom can't really be understood through the mechanisms of science and external experience. But Kant wants to say, these ideas are at least necessary to organize my practical life, and for that reason should be accepted. By practical life here, Kant means my moral and ethical life. So what Kant ends up claiming is that we have this experience, at least of ourselves, as moral beings, as beings for which certain things are required, and we have certain duties, both to ourselves and to others, as beings for which our actions matter and have meaning and purpose. Now, Kant thinks that this experience of ourselves as moral agents can only make sense if these other elements are taken on as well. Kant believes God has to exist because in life as we experience it here, people who do bad stuff often get rewarded for that. And so living a moral life, if we're talking about consequences in this world we experience, doesn't make sense unless there's a judge to apportion to us what we deserve outside of what we experience in this world. The same is true for Kant of the afterlife. The afterlife has to exist as that place where just rewards are distributed. And of course, ethics doesn't make any sense at all unless human beings have freedom. Because if we're not free to act, it's difficult to see how we can be responsible for the actions we take, and thus how ethics matters at all, and how God could justly reward or punish us for the actions that we take. So we've made our way through our final historical philosopher here. After this, most of the philosophers we'll see now are philosophers who are actually still active in university philosophy programs, and they'll be looking at these same questions through a modern lens.